And not really to be morbid, but this episode was actually kind of inspired by the fact that one of the members in this group has passed away just recently, and that would be Robbie Robertson. The group, of course, is the band, but they actually started in 1957. At that point, they were called the Hawks, and they were a backing band for a Canadian singer, Ronnie Hawkins. The Hawks were very popular in Canada, and they actually recorded a few singles. But by 1963, the band was getting pretty fed up with Ronnie Hawkins and wanted to branch out and do their own stuff. After they left Hawkins, they became the Canadian Squires for a while, and then actually Levon and the Hawks. And then they crossed paths with Bob Dylan and became his backing band for a while. And then they morphed into the band. Yeah, let's head up to Cripple Creek. Let's drop the needle. We'll start by introducing our cast of characters. The band consisted of Rick Danko on bass, guitar, vocals, and fiddle, Garth Hudson on organ, keyboards, accordion, and sometimes saxophone, Richard Manuel on piano, drums, and vocals, Levon Helm on drums, vocals, mandolin, and guitar, and then their main songwriter, guitarist, and sometime vocalist was Robbie Robertson. In 1965, Bob Dylan wanted a new musical direction. He felt really boxed in with all the success he had had as an acoustic folk singer and protest singer. He wanted to go electric. But to do that, he needed a backing band. Well, and someone told him he needed to go out to Toronto and check on this band that was playing there. So he did, and he was so impressed, he decided to hire Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm right on the spot. But they convinced Bob that what he really needed was to hire the entire group. And so he did, and that's how they became the backing band for him when Bob Dylan went out on tour. And the tour was billed as Bob Dylan and the Band. Now, to say that the tour was chaotic is really putting it mildly. Bob's fans, who were mainly folk purists, hated the idea of him trying to go electric. And so they were booed and heckled at almost every stop on the tour. In fact, on one of the stops of the tour in England, when they decide to start playing the electric set of music, one fan from the crowd yells out to Dylan and calls him Judas. And Dylan says, "I don't believe you." And then he turns around to Robbie Robertson and says, "Play the next song, effing loud." And they broke into Like a Rolling Stone. After the tour, Bob Dylan records Blonde on Blonde, with Robbie Robertson appearing on the record. In July of 1966, Dylan has a motorcycle accident, and so he decides to retreat from the public eye and just kind of settle down in up around Woodstock, New York. Meanwhile, the band goes back to playing in bars. When Dylan felt good enough, he started hanging out with the band, who had rented a house nearby that they called Big Pink. And they started recording there a bunch of demo songs, which became the famous Basement Tapes. But that wasn't released until many years later in 1975. After recording these demos with Dylan, the band decides that they have enough of their own material that they want to record their own album. And so in 1968, they release the first album, which is called Music from Big Pink. And Dylan gives them a favor by painting the album's cover. The album was very well received, and the sound was unlike almost anything else out there. Lots of good music on this record. Here are some of my favorites. The lead-off, Tears of Rage, and of course the great The Wait, Long Black Veil, Chest Fever, and this Wheels on Fire. On the success of this album, the band goes out on tour, and in fact they actually played the Woodstock Festival. And then they decide to release their second album, which is simply called The Band. All the songs evoke an early American time. Standouts, in my opinion, are Across the Great Divide, Rag Mama Rag, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Up on Cripple Creek, Jemima's Surrender, Look Out Cleveland, and King Harvest Has Surely Come. The album peaks at number 9 in the US. And again, they go out on tour to support the album. But for their next recording, they decide to hire a young, up-and-coming engineer to engineer the album for them, as they're going to produce it themselves. And the engineer was Todd Rundgren. And the album that they created together was called Stage Fright. I like Just Another Whistle Stop, the great The Shape I'm In. Then there's W.S. Walcott's Medicine Show, Stage Fright, and The Rumor. The album did very well, hitting number 5 in the US and 15 in the UK. The band would seem like they were on a roll, but as with a lot of classic rock groups, there was tension inside the group. And in this case, it was Robbie Robertson exerting more and more control over the direction of the group, which this really did not set well with Levon Helm. And a lot of members of the group were getting addicted to drugs. Despite all of this, in 1971, they released an album called Cahoots. It starts with Life is a Carnival. Then we have Dylan's When I Paint My Masterpiece. Van Morrison joins them to give vocals to a song he co-wrote with Robbie, 4% Pantomime. I also like Shootout in Chinatown, The Moonstruck One, Thinking Out Loud, and Smoke Signal. Then it's time for a live album. So in 1972, they release a double album called Rock of Ages. I really like this album, and it contains, of course, most of their hits that they had had up at that point, and a lot of great songs. And an interesting side note, Alan Toussaint did the horn charts, so the horns add a whole new dimension to the sound of the band. The album did very well. In 1973, they released an album called Moondog Matinee, and it's an album of cover songs, and there's a reason for this. At this point in time, the band could not get it together enough to work on any new material. All they could do was go back and rehash songs that they liked or that they used to play when they were the Hawks. And that's what this album is. But I like it. It's a fun record. I like Ain't Got No Home, Mystery Train, the instrumental Third Man theme, The Great Pretender, and A Change Is Gonna Come. But they couldn't get it together to tour to support this record, and it got very mixed reviews. Then along comes Bob Dylan to kind of save the day, in that he wants the band to record with him on the record he's making, which became Planet Waves. And then in 1974, to support that album, they go out on tour again as Bob Dylan and the band. And I want to tell you, that was an incredible tour. I saw them when they played the Forum in Los Angeles. And when Bob walked out on stage, the place just went nuts. It was a great show. And in fact, after the tour was over, they released an album of the tour called Before the Flood. After the Dylan tour, the band is once again re-energized and decides to make a new album of original material, which is called Northern Lights, Southern Cross. Songs include Ophelia, Arcadian Driftwood, It Makes No Difference. But the album didn't sell very well, and when they went out on tour, all of a sudden they find themselves playing smaller and smaller venues. In 1976, Richard Manuel suffers a very serious boating accident, and Robbie Robertson decides that they should stop touring and performing live. But he's got an idea. He wants to make sure they do one final farewell concert. And what a concert that was. It was even filmed by Martin Scorsese, and it is known as The Last Waltz. In addition to the band, great artists include Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Van Morrison, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, and many more. In 1977, they released their last album for Capitol Records to fulfill their contract, and it's called Islands. And it contains old songs that were never really released before, and it isn't very well received, and it certainly doesn't sell. But never mind, in 1978, the band bounces back, and boy do they bounce back, because first, Martin Scorsese releases his film of The Last Waltz, and then the band releases a soundtrack from The Last Waltz, which is a triple album, and both are huge hits. But even with the success of The Last Waltz, Robbie Robertson is so disappointed at the reaction to the album Islands that he decides he's going to leave the group. So the rest of them decide to continue on. But in March of 1986, Richard Manuel hangs himself in his motel room. He is only 42 years old. They released their 8th studio album, which is called Jericho. But at this point, you've got the fact that Robbie is sorely missed. You've got Levon Helm, Garth Hudson, and Rick Danko playing on the album. And they're joined by a number of other musicians to help out. Some strong songs are Dylan's Blind Willie McTell, The Caves of Jericho, and Bruce Springsteen's Atlantic City. Robbie Robertson rejoins them in 1994 when they get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But interestingly enough, Levon Helm, who had been fighting with Robertson for years over songwriting credits, does not attend the induction ceremony. The band released 2 more albums, High on the Hog in 1996 and Jubilation in 1998. But the following year, in 1999, Rick Danko died in his sleep at the age of 55. Levon Helm went on to have a very successful solo career, and in 2012, he died from throat cancer. He was 71 years old. Robbie Robertson had a very successful solo career as well. He actually then kind of morphed into doing film scores for his friend Martin Scorsese. Some of those films include Raging Bull, The King of Comedy, Casino, The Wolf of Wall Street, The Irishman, and the latest film, Killers of the Flower Moon. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, Robbie died just recently after a long fight with cancer. He was 80 years old. That means the only surviving member of the band is Garth Hudson, and he's a very sought-after session musician. Yeah, he's still working, and he's 86 years old. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist, which will contain some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode, so you can go back and listen to the great music that was put out by the band. So for a group who started out as the backing band for Ronnie Hawkins, and then the backing band for Bob Dylan, and helped him in recording the demos for the Basement tapes, and then went on to create many, many very, very good albums on their own. The band proved that they could really carry that weight, even if they had stage fright. Now, as always, thanks for watching. I'm going to be up on Cripple Creek, and you keep a rockin'. If you like this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.